Hi, I'm Steve Hamilton, presenting for CityTram. Today, I'm going to talk about taxis. Taxis have been around for a very long time. In fact, they predate the car itself. Recently, Uber has offered a new modern take on the taxi system. They're building a market following of some consequence. They've certainly garnered a lot of attention, and there are those who claim Uber will put public transit out of business. CityTram's intent is to improve public transit, and our analysis leads to the conclusion that public transit must move away from being mass transit and toward being personal transit. A taxi system is clearly a way to do that. So it's worth looking at taxi systems in some depth to see if they might be a solution. Now, all CityTram analysis is based upon the commuter decision model which we've developed, and which we believe to date has proven an accurate model for the market. It says that for each trip, the commuter does a pass-fail filter on the available commuting options. Will I feel safe? Does it go where I need to go? Can it handle any cargo that I might need to take on this particular trip? And is it flexible enough? For example, I can use it to get to the baseball game, but if the game goes extra innings, can I still get home? Or if my wife might need me to pick up the child from music lessons on the way home from work, can I reroute on the fly? Choosing among the options that pass through this filter then is simple. What's the fastest way that I can afford? And remember, for most Americans, one of the available options is a personally owned automobile. A taxi system is just a different way to deploy a car. It uses the same technology. So taxi speed is essentially identical to that of private ownership. Thus, speed is neither an advantage nor a disadvantage. The success of a taxi system, therefore, as the basis for a general transportation solution, turns completely upon its affordability. So we must look in some detail at the economics of car ownership and taxi operation in order to determine whether we could build a viable personal transit system based upon them. In order to do that, there are two things that we must understand first. One is what I call the boredom fee. The second is the cost of a taxi driver. Then, after some cost comparisons, we'll also need to think a bit about the problem of taxi dispatch. The boredom fee has to do with how most people buy cars, or rather, why they do it badly. This fee represents an opportunity for taxi companies to gain a cost advantage by being smarter. Now, cars have gotten better. It used to be that a car with nearly 100,000 miles on it was about dead. Today, it's reasonable to expect 150,000 miles or 200,000 miles from a car. So let's look at the purchase of a vehicle with an expected life of 200,000 miles. It costs about $30,000. The average American drives about 12,500 miles a year. That makes the life expectancy for this vehicle 16 years. If I buy it and then keep it for 16 years and then junk it, then I've both paid for and used 100% of the vehicle. If so, then the vehicle will cost me about 15 cents per mile. But 16 years is a pretty long time to drive the same car. It gets familiar, then it gets a little old, and Americans love new things. So suppose after driving it for 7 years, I see an ad on TV and wander down to the local dealership, and the dealer makes me a great deal on a new car. He gives me $7,000 trade-in value for my old car that has almost 88,000 miles on it. Well, I just paid 77% of the price for that older car in order to use 44% of it. My price per mile just went up to 34 cents per mile, more than doubled. Now, many people acquire a car with a lease. at least formalizes this kind of deal up front by bundling together the purchase, the financing, and the trade-in into a single contract. The biggest difference between the economics of taxi and of a private vehicle is that the taxi driver must get paid, while the private vehicle driver is not. This is a big cost disadvantage for the taxis. Let's look at an unrealistically optimal case. Consider a taxi driver who's never idle. He's always driving, and in fact, is never even on a pickup run. He always is carrying a paying fare. Car trips average between 11 and maybe 23 miles per hour in most cities, so let's assume an average driving speed of 15 miles per hour. He works 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, 50 days a year, and gets 2 weeks vacation. Under these conditions, he will produce for the taxi company 30,000 revenue miles per year. Suppose he earns $30,000 per year, which is really only about $15 per hour, soon to be the minimum wage in many states. He would be the most productive taxi driver in history, and his salary alone, with no allowance for taxes or benefits, would add $1 to the fare. That's it, $1 per mile. Now, the relative affordability of a taxi system comes into much better focus with this knowledge. In this graph, we compare the cost of the car operation for various entities, assuming that same 200,000 mile, $30,000 vehicle. The middle 3 bars on the graph show the cost per mile for private ownership. The average owner in the middle drives 12,500 miles a year. The light owner just above that drives only half as much. And the heavy owner just below that drives twice as much. The topmost bar shows the cost the average owner would experience if he didn't pay the boredom fee. He was a smart, patient, and disciplined buyer. The bottom bar shows the cost per mile if a taxi company operates the vehicle and gets on average 10 paying riders per day, so that the vehicle racks up 10 times as many miles as the average owner. The magic is that some of the operating costs for a car are mileage-based, while others are time-based. Fuel, maintenance, and repairs are mileage-based. These are all the same for all the owners. But vehicle purchase, financing, registration and licensing, and insurance are time-based. So the more rapidly the vehicle accumulates miles, the lower the per mile contribution of those costs. We can see that the average American pays 73 cents per mile for his personal car, with 19 cents per mile of that being the boredom fee. A taxi vehicle that's able to accumulate miles 10 times faster is cheaper at about 42 cents per mile. Realistically, however, not all miles driven by a taxi are revenue miles. Some of the miles are driven empty in order to go pick up a rider. The efficiency of dispatch depends upon a number of factors that can vary quite a bit. A pickup overhead of about 25% would bring the taxi operating costs to 53 cents per mile, or roughly equivalent to that of the smart private owner. Now, as soon as we add in the cost of the taxi driver, the story becomes clear. The taxi system is simply not economically competitive with a system based upon private ownership. The cost difference is more than 2 to 1 for the average commuter, and still quite substantial even for the very light commuter. This is why taxis have always been a niche solution. Now, it's worth noting in this discussion that the discussion is about cost, not about price. If a public transit agency wanted to subsidize taxi travel in a similar way that they do bus and train travel, then the consumer visible price could be altered in a way that might actually shape the market decisions. The difference in costs shown here can inform about the size of the subsidy that would be required. Now, the graph should make it obvious also why taxi companies are so interested in level 5 autonomous vehicles. It's only by eliminating the cost of the driver that they have any realistic shot at the general market. By subsidizing fares today, Uber delays millennials' first car purchase decision while building its customer base, and uses this to bridge the gap until robocars are available, which it actually needs in order to economically survive. Now, in typical retail markets, the cost of sales and administration of a company is often around 100% up relative to the cost of goods. But in wholesale markets, it can be lower. With autonomous taxis, the COSA overhead will determine actually the minimum pricing that the company can survive with. And it looks like this pricing should allow them to successfully compete with private ownership for at least some portion of the commuting population. They would need to bring COSA down to about 40% to become competitive for the average commuter. Now, I have no idea how feasible this is for this business. Again, it's worth looking at these economics from the perspective of a public transit agency. Without the need to make a profit or to pay income taxes, a public agency has a much better shot at lowering this COSA to an effective point. And there's also some cost sharing with mass transit activities that could be exploited. We know that the agencies will already bear the infrastructure cost burdens for robocars, so why leave the profits to private enterprise? Finally, even without in-house operations, the robocar taxi subsidization becomes far more feasible. Now, this graph shows the same economic calculus, but it starts to bring into consideration some other aspects of robotaxi deployment. Today, Uber rates are both time-based and distance-based, so we use those published rates for UberX and calculate the per mile costs for trips of various lengths at various speeds. You'll note that private ownership is still cheaper in all cases, even for the light commuter. But if we lower those costs by $1 per mile to reflect the impact of eliminating the taxi driver, the competitive picture changes. The average commuter in America travels 34.2 miles per day. You can think of that as 17.1 mile trip each way to and from work. Robo-Uber gets more competitive for longer trips. So anything over 7 miles, it's cheaper. The light commuter going half as far would likely have about half the distance of a commute, maybe 8 miles. And for anything over 3 miles, Robo-Uber is cheaper for him. Now, a little caution is warranted here. Current UberX rates are artificially low, right? They're subsidized to build market share. So this picture is just a little bit distorted from long-term reality. Now, when you're trying to decide on a strategy, as in should I compete or collaborate, it's important to understand motivations and incentives. Commercial taxi companies are motivated by revenue and profit. Now, the taxi company gets more revenue for a longer trip, but that trip keeps the taxi occupied for a longer period, and it may take the taxi farther away from its next pickup, which means it can execute fewer revenue-producing trips. So how is revenue maximized? Is it better to have a bunch of short trips or a fewer number of longer trips? The top graph answers that question based upon the same UberX Miami data. Uber will follow the reality, and we know they will optimize their pricing, advertising, and dispatch, trying to shape the service so that they get more revenue by having longer trips. Now, of course, a similar question can be asked about capacity. The answer in this case is relatively obvious. You move more people faster by performing lots of short trips. So what we see here is the transit system's interest in capacity and the taxi operator's interest in revenue are in opposition. Now, when viewed as part of a system, rather than as a standalone for-profit business, it may be more useful to think of the capacity question as the inverse of actually what's shown here. If we know the demand for a particular region, then we can actually set that as the capacity and flip the question around to ask how many taxis will be needed to provide that capacity, which is what this graph shows. It's also worth noting that dispatch is higher under random demand than under demand that reflects some sort of migratory pattern, and that this difference grows considerably with distance. So that means that the system is probably best deployed in suburban areas where the demand is likely highest for longer and randomly distributed trips, or maybe in regions which can somehow be geographically limited where the demand is relatively low to begin with, such as maybe serving mass transit stations in a residential area. Now, the first of these obviously would be of commercial interest to taxi companies. The latter may actually require public implementation or at least contracting. Dispatch algorithms could be a topic of an entire separate discussion, which we won't do here. Suffice it to say that a single trip can be thought of as a three-dimensional quantity with a starting point, a destination, and a travel time. A transit demand scenario can then be thought of as a time-ordered sequence of such trips. And the taxi service allocates some number n of vehicles to serve this demand. The dispatch algorithm is simply how specific vehicles get assigned to specific trips. Now, the dispatch decisions impact a large number of important quantities. The wait time a rider experiences impacts his satisfaction with the system performance and therefore his likelihood of continuing as a customer. The wait time trends closely together with the pickup overhead, which we discussed earlier. Minimizing this overhead is important because it controls the cost of the service. Now, the easiest way to minimize both pickup overhead and wait time is to deploy a lot of vehicles. But this then minimizes the miles per vehicle, or the sharing multiple, which we also discussed earlier. So maintaining a high sharing multiple is critical to minimizing the per mile cost of the service. Different types of demand scenarios exist, as I kind of suggested before. Some have fairly random geographic distribution of the trip starting points and end points. On the other hand, migratory scenarios exhibit geographic clustering of either starting points or ending points. Dispatch algorithms do not perform equally well for these different types of scenarios. So the earlier cost analysis should not leave one with an overly optimistic picture, right? The analysis was based upon high sharing multiple, 10x, a low pickup overhead, 25%, and satisfied customers. It is yet unproven that a dispatch algorithm exists to achieve these targets for any, let alone for all, demand scenarios. So with fair warning given regarding both the importance of and the unproven nature of dispatch solutions, we can now look at both current and future taxi systems and see how they fit into the competitive space. Current taxi systems are simply not economically competitive, and therefore they will remain a niche solution. However, future taxi systems based upon self-driving vehicles are competitive, and as a technology. They become slightly less competitive when they must also carry the burdens of a commercial enterprise, administrative, overhead, taxes, and profit. But they should be considered a serious competitive threat or alternative to bus systems in particular. And this is somewhat of a mixed blessing. On the negative side, the pickup segments will increase the total number of vehicle miles driven. There's no reason to expect a greater degree of true, as in simultaneous, ride sharing than is present today with private autos. So that means congestion will increase. Software-based drivers are quirky, shall we say, and likely to remain so for quite a while. And this will lead to more congestion issues and increase in the number of accidents. Now, eventually this will lessen. The ecological impact is a bit ambiguous. Buses currently achieve about twice the passenger miles per gallon as do singly occupied cars. So a mass conversion could represent an ecological disaster. However, it's likely that robo-taxi fleets that will be introduced will be electrified. And this would significantly improve the average commuter miles per gallon. And additionally, taxi systems are on demand. So it will only consume energy when commuters are actually in transit. And this is unlike a bus fleet where the vehicles are moving according to a schedule regardless of ridership. So it's likely that the net ecological effect will be positive, resulting from the electrified and on-demand nature of the new system rather actually than from its self-driving nature. Now, if this new market is given over to commercial interests, I think it's critical that regulations require the electrification. Failure to do so would waste a rare and vital climate change opportunity. It's important to recognize that there actually will be the opportunity for three separate and simultaneous markets for robocars. The auto manufacturers started down this path with the expectations of a retail market, a way to offer new extra cost features on future car sales with the possibility for subscription pricing. These features might entice a few additional people to purchase cars, and they likely will entice a few drivers to drive more miles. But the impact on road demand, I think, will be minimal. And we've just examined how this new technology provides significant new financial opportunities to taxi companies. This will clearly increase miles driven to accommodate the pickup trips. The extent of the impact on road demand will depend upon the size of this new market and on the effectiveness of the dispatch algorithms. But the opportunity also exists for public transit agencies themselves to be the taxi companies. Their not-for-profit nature offers an opportunity for optimizing the system. System capacity can be the focus rather than revenue, and the system can operate synergistically with mass transit systems. The result could be increased ridership and improved economic performance and a major reduction in road demand that would benefit transit agencies. While at the same time, much improved service would be available to improve the life of commuters. And ecological optimization would be there to help save the planet. CityTram votes in favor of this option.